It began not with the clamor of steel, but with a whisper of wind through the battlements, a sound so lonely it could have been a ghost's sigh. He was just a boy then, a name and a lineage thrust upon a frame not yet ready for the weight of it all. The great hall, meant to be a place of warmth and feasting, felt like a mausoleum. Its stone walls, carved with the glories of his father, offered no comfort. A fire crackled in the hearth, but its light seemed only to deepen the shadows, to make the ancient tapestries on the walls seem to writhe with forgotten histories and untold pains. He sat on the throne, a thing of carved oak and cold iron, and felt the immense, terrifying silence of a king alone. He would remember the smell of it all forever, the sweet, cloying scent of roasted boar mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of cold dread. The nobles, a collection of faces and titles, watched him from the edges of the light. Their eyes were sharp, judging every hesitant movement, every nervous twitch of his hand upon the gilded armrest. They saw a boy where they needed a warrior. They saw a question mark where they craved a full stop. The crown, a circlet of meticulously wrought gold, was less a symbol of power and more a shackle, a physical embodiment of a promise he was not sure he could keep. It pressed against his brow, a constant, dull ache that mirrored the thrumming fear in his heart. He ran his fingers over the carved hawk on the throne's arm, its form sleek and powerful, an apex predator frozen in wood. He, by contrast, felt like a fledgling, pushed too early from the nest. The whispers had started weeks ago, carried on the salt-laden northern winds. Stories of longships, of dragons carved into their prows, of raids that left nothing but ash, bone, and the echo of screams. These were not mere stories to be told by a winter fire. They were prophecies delivered on the very air he breathed. The memory of his father's last grasp haunted him. A hand, encased in cold iron gauntlet, reaching for him not in comfort, but in a final, desperate transfer of burden. The gauntlet had been cold and unforgiving, a premonition of the world he was now forced to inhabit. The vow he had made over his father's still body to protect his people felt like a child's foolish promise, an echo in an empty chamber. Now the distant sound of horns was carried on the wind, a sound that was not the signal for a hunt, but a challenge, a declaration of war from a sea he could not command. He gripped the small, leather-bound psalter he carried, a relic from his mother, a memory of a time when the world was simpler, when faith was a shield, not a fragile hope. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, and the familiar words of prayer offered no solace against the creeping dread. He thought of the simple, worn rope that pulled the great bell in the village church, how its duty was clear and resolute, to call people together. His burden, he feared, was to ring a bell that would scatter his people to the winds, a bell that would toll for mourning, not for worship. He felt his kingdom, this vast, cold land of stone and forest, not as his own, but as a debt, an heirloom of immense unpayable value, which men with axes and a lust for fire were now coming to collect. The golden crown felt heavier than ever, a beacon for a storm. He was a boy playing at being a king, waiting for the true kings, those from the sea and the wind, to come and tear down his stone fortress. He was the gilded cage, and the world was now a hungry hawk circling high above. He looked at the faces of his nobles again, and this time he saw not judgment, but the pale, brittle fear he saw reflected in his own eyes. A silent prayer, thin and desperate, escaped his lips, not to his God, but to his memory of his father, a plea for strength he knew would go unanswered. The candle flame on the table next to him wavered, a small, fragile life in a hall of immense and unforgiving shadows. His kingdom was not built of stone, but of 1,000 silent, invisible threads, and they were all beginning to fray. He closed his eyes and saw not the future of a king, but the past of a boy. A boy running through a sun-dappled field, his mother's hand warm in his. A boy with no crown, no kingdom, only the simple, profound joy of a world that was still whole. He felt the weight of the moment like a physical blow, a great suffocating wave of history crashing down upon him. He knew that the boy he had been was gone, lost somewhere between his father's final breath and the first horn call from the sea. Now, there was only the king and the cold, unyielding silence of a world about to be remade in fire. A world where a simple woman at a loom with her own quiet strength and a loom of her own was a truer monarch than he. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, was the only thing that truly knew the secrets of the longhouse. It rattled the frost-laced thatch and found its way through every crack in the timber, a cold finger tracing the lines of a woman's face as she sat at her loom. She was a silhouette against the small, pulsing heart of the hearth fire, her hands moving with the practiced hypnotic rhythm of a lifetime. The longhouse smelled of wood smoke and sheep's wool, a familiar comfort that felt dangerously fragile. On the wall behind her hung a shield and an axe, not the implements of a man, but her own, inherited from a time when the world had demanded a different kind of strength from her. Her husband had been swallowed by the gray earth a decade ago, a nameless casualty of some forgotten border skirmish, a life reduced to a single name carved into a wooden marker. The silence of the house was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath. It was the stillness that precedes a storm, the taut anticipation that fills the air when the world is poised on the edge of ruin. She had heard the whispers, carried from the market towns by passing merchants and pilgrims, the new king's edicts, his heavy-handed promises of protection from the Northmen. But protection came at a price, a slow, steady bleed of coin and grain from the villages. She had seen the king's tax collectors, their faces as hard and unyielding as the winter stone, their eyes blind to the hunger that hollowed out the faces of her neighbors. The king's justice felt like a second wave of raiders, a more subtle, but no less devastating, kind of violence. The loom was her kingdom, the threads her subjects. She wove a tapestry, not of grand heroes or crowned heads, but of the very thing that haunted her people. A single, small, red-sailed ship on a black sea, its form both simple and utterly terrifying. The red thread was the color of a child's cloak and the color of blood spilled on a snow-covered field. It was the color of wine and of the deepest, most profound sorrow. She saw the kingdom itself as a great loom, its countless interconnected threads of lives and loves, hopes and fears, being pulled tighter and tighter by men who had never felt the weight of a spindle, who only understood the language of steel and gold. The bells of the distant monastery, a sound that had once been a source of comfort and a call to faith, now rang with a different message. A call to a war she was too old to fight, and a king she was too weary to believe in. The bells were a beautiful sound, but they were also a lie. She ran her thumb over the rough wool of the tapestry, the threads a coarse mirror of her own hardened hands. She was a Shieldmaiden without a shield, a warrior whose battles were fought with patience and a knife at her side. She remembered her mother telling her stories of the old gods, of goddesses who were not distant and perfect, but rooted in the earth, in the turning of the seasons, in the raw, messy business of life and death. The new god was a distant king in a distant sky, and the new king was a distant boy in a cold stone fortress. Neither of them seemed to understand the texture of mud under a boot or the specific, chilling taste of fear. The tapestry grew, thread by thread, a silent chronicle of a world in peril. The small, red-sailed ship was a scar on the black, empty sea, a perfect, terrible image of the approaching doom. She knew, with the deep, quiet certainty of a woman who had seen too much and lost too many, that this was the real story of the kingdom. Not the glorious tales of the court, but the quiet, constant, unending struggle for a single thread of life in a world that sought to unravel it. The last of the fire's embers in the hearth glowed and faded, leaving the longhouse in a deeper darkness. She put her work aside, the unfinished tapestry a banner of a war yet to be fought. She felt the heavy silence of the night, and in the heart of that silence, she heard the distant, unmistakable cry of a newborn lamb, a fragile, hopeful sound that was a small, defiant promise of life in a world that was determined to forget it. The cold, damp air of the castle's deepest chamber was thick with the scent of ancient stone and the ghosts of forgotten kings. The only sound was the rhythmic, precise ring of hammer on chisel, a sharp metallic note that echoed through the vast, empty halls. A sculptor, a man with a beard like a winter frost and hands scarred from his trade, worked in the meager light of a tallow candle. His subject was a block of hard, unforgiving granite, and from its heart, a king was slowly emerging. This was not the boy king with the nervous hands and haunted eyes. This was the king as he demanded to be seen, a brutal, unyielding force of nature, his expression a mask of cold, grim power. The king himself watched from the shadows, a silent, armored specter. His gauntlets, polished steel that caught and twisted the dim light, rested on the hilt of his greatsword. They were cold, unyielding, a second skin of iron. They were the truest part of him, an extension of the will that had hardened his heart against the world. On a chain around his neck, half hidden beneath his heavy tunic, he wore a small, simple iron key. It was not a key to the treasury or to a secret dungeon, but to a small, dusty chapel where his mother was buried. A place of warmth and memory he had not visited in years, for to visit it was to acknowledge a past he had systematically dismantled, to admit a sentiment he now considered a fatal weakness. He had learned the hard way that to rule was not to love, but to break. The whispers of the northern ships now came with a new name, a name that was not a faceless threat, but a rival. A man whose reputation for brutality was a mirror of his own. A Viking warlord, a king of the waves, whose name was spoken with a mix of fear and reverence even in his own court. The king had built his kingdom on iron and fear, a fortress of stone designed to keep the world out. But the stone, he was learning, was also a prison. He watched as the sculptor's hammer chipped away at the stone, revealing the unyielding face beneath. He understood that this cold, lifeless rock was his legacy. Not a legacy of life or of love, but of stone and rust, of unbending will and unfeeling power. He remembered the feel of his father's hand, the cold metal of his gauntlet, the final desperate transfer of power. His father had been a giant, a king of men. He was a man made of stone. The bell of the distant church tolled, a hollow, mournful sound, not for him, but for a commoner who had succumbed to a fever. A death the king barely registered. For he saw his people not as individual lives, but as a mass of bodies to be defended, or, if necessary, sacrificed for the good of the kingdom. He had forgotten the faces, the names, the quiet joys and sorrows of the people he ruled. He saw them only as a wall of flesh to stand between him and the chaos of the sea. The sculptor delivered a final, delicate hammer blow, and a flake of granite fell away, revealing the last, grim detail of the statue's face. The empty, cold eyes stared out into the darkness of the chamber, reflecting the lonely truth of the man who had ordered it. The king was a man of rock, and the world was now a sea. The waves were coming, and his stone heart would not feel their cold embrace. He was a fortress built against the storm, but a fortress can be both a sanctuary and a tomb. He held the greatsword's hilt tighter, the cold metal a familiar reassurance. He had traded a living, breathing heart for a heart of stone, and in doing so, he had become the very thing he feared the most, a monument to a life he was no longer living. A distant shout from a guard on the ramparts, a signal of an approaching scout, broke the quiet. The game had begun, and he was ready. But he was a king who ruled over stones, and a world of living, breathing chaos was about to descend upon him. And in the heart of that chaos, a woman in a convent, with her veil and her memories, was a truer queen than he would ever be a king. The candlelight in the abbey chapel was a small, defiant gesture against the creeping darkness. It danced and flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the face of the abbess as she knelt, her head bowed over a great illuminated manuscript. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old vellum, a smell of history and holiness that had filled these stone halls for centuries. Her fingers, fine and bony, traced the lines of a painted saint, a woman holding a palm frond of martyrdom. This saint, in her vibrant, stylized colors, felt more real to the abbess than the world outside the abbey walls. Her life was one of cloistered silence, of prayer and ritual, a world defined by the high, cold stone walls that separated her from a kingdom she was born to rule. She was an exile, a sister to the king, a life of power and politics traded for a life of silent devotion. Her veil, a symbol of her faith, was also a wall, a physical separation from the brother who had sent her here in her youth. He had done it for her protection, he said, to keep her from the messy, violent business of ruling. But she knew the truth. She had been a rival, a potential heir with a lineage as strong as his own, and a mind too sharp for his comfort. She had been sent to a place where her power could be contained, her voice silenced, her ambition transformed into prayer. She had been here for decades, and her world was small, contained, and quiet. But the world outside had a way of seeping in. She heard the muted, distant sounds of the world through the thick stone walls, the bleating of sheep, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and, more recently, the more sinister sound of a soldier's boot on the cobblestones. The king had sent his men to the abbey, not for prayer, but for supplies and for news of the north. He saw the abbey not as a house of God, but as a resource to be plundered, its wealth of grain and wine to be siphoned for a war he had yet to fight. He was building his war machine on the back of his people and his faith, blind to the fact that faith, like grain, was a finite resource. The abbess knew a different kind of power, a power not of swords, but of stories. She had spent her life collecting them, not from books, but from the whispered tales of the women who came to the abbey for solace. The stories of their fathers, their brothers, and their sons who went off to fight and never returned. She saw the kingdom not as a fortress of stone, but as a fragile web of countless lives. A web that was now being torn apart by the two great powers of the world, her brother and the faceless Viking warlord. She had a memory from her youth of a young king so obsessed with building stone walls that he forgot to tend to the garden within. The garden was now overgrown with weeds and choked with fear, and the walls, she knew, would eventually crumble. She closed the illuminated book, the soft thud of final, profound sound in the quiet chapel. Her veil, the very symbol of her seclusion, was also the curtain behind which she was watching the world burn. She knew that her brother's power was a lie built on fear, and the true power of the kingdom lay not in the great halls of the castle, but in the quiet, steady resilience of the people, the countless threads of life that she now held in her hands. The bell in the tower rang out the hour for prayer, a sound that she knew was a small, quiet act of resistance against the chaos of the world. It was a sound that told the world that faith, like the small, fragile light of a candle, could not be extinguished. The morning mist was a cold, thick shroud, a living thing that clung to the gnarled skeletal branches of a great oak. Beneath its ancient canopy, a boy sat, his small frame hunched against the chill. He was no older than 10, and his hands, thin and nimble, worked a knife over a piece of polished bone. It was an elk antler, worn smooth by his constant handling, and into its surface he was carving a tiny boat, a vessel with the head of a dragon at its prow. The world smelled of damp earth and the acrid smoke of peat fires, a scent that was the very breath of his people. He was not of the king's kingdom, not of the distant, warm stone halls. He was of the Northmen, a boy left behind with the women and the old men while the warriors went to sea. He had never known a world without the clang of steel, the sharp, guttural cries of men in battle, the roar of the sea that was both his people's lifeblood and their insatiable hunger. His father and his brothers were raiders, men who came to this land to take what was needed, to claim a life that the unforgiving northern soil would not give them. He had been taught to revere them, to see them as gods of the sea, as unstoppable forces of nature. But in his small, quiet heart, he remembered the fear in his mother's eyes when she spoke their names. He saw not heroes, but men who were haunted by a relentless need, driven by a hunger that could never be filled. The carving was meticulous, the tiny boat a perfect, miniature representation of the longships that now lay hidden in the fog of the nearby fjord. But the boat he carved had no sail, no rudder, a symbol of a journey with no true destination. He was crafting a vessel for his fear, a tiny, powerless thing in a vast and brutal world. He thought of the small, wooden horse he had once found in a raided village, lying forgotten in the churned mud, a broken toy left behind by a terrified child. A child no different from himself. He carried that image in his mind like a stone in his pocket, a heavy, silent weight that was a constant reminder of the price of his father's glory. He heard the faint, far-off sound of bells from a distant village, a sound that was foreign and strange, a call to an order and a ritual that his people did not have. He was a son of chaos, and the bells were a sound of a world that believed in peace, a world he knew his people were coming to shatter. He knew that soon, his father and the other warriors would return, their longships laden with spoils, their faces grim with the stories they would not tell. And he knew that the king, the brutal king of the stone fortress, would send his men to meet them. He saw the two great forces, the king's men and his father's men, not as right and wrong, not as good and evil, but as two great unyielding stones, grinding against each other with a terrible, inevitable force. and all he saw in his mind's eye was the dust of countless lives that would be crushed between them. The small bone boat was a vessel for his quiet dread, a tiny, fragile creation in a world that was being torn apart. He looked up at the sky, at the same indifferent gray sky that hung over the king's castle and the abbess's convent and the fields of the peasants. The sky held no answers, only a cold, indifferent promise of a long winter to come. He ran his hand over the polished bone, the carving a silent prayer for a different life, a prayer he knew would never be answered. He was the son of a raider, a boy marked by the sea and the axe, and there was no escape from the blood that ran in his veins. The bone boat, perfect in its tiny, powerless form, was his only act of defiance. It was a silent wish for a journey that was not a raid, for a destination that was not a grave. The wind howled through the narrow, crooked streets of the village, a sound that was both mournful and angry. The first snow of winter had fallen, a soft, silent blanket over a land still stained with the dark memory of ash and blood. The village church stood in the center of the quiet, ravaged settlement, a solitary monument to loss. Its great wooden door was blackened by fire, scarred and blistered, but it stood fast, a defiant survivor of a recent raid. The air, crisp with the cold of the new snow, still held the faint, bitter scent of smoke and burnt timber. An old man, the village elder, stood before the door, his face a map of grief and resilience, each line a testament to a life lived in the unforgiving world. His hand, gnarled and trembling, ran over the scorched wood, the touch a silent communion with the memory of the fire. He had lived through many raids, had seen longships and warriors come and go, but this one was different. The raiders, the fearsome men of the north, were not just looking for gold or grain this time. They had come for something more, for a deeper wound. They had come to break the spirit of the people, to leave a mark that would be more painful than any stolen coin. They had tried to burn the church, to destroy the very symbol of the people's faith, their only comfort against the cold, indifferent world. The elder had heard the stories of the king's response, of a brutal force coming to avenge them. But he had also seen the king's tax collectors, their eyes cold and calculating, their hands outstretched for the meager wealth that was all that remained. He knew that the price of this vengeance would be paid not in coin, but in lives, in the lives of the young men who would be conscripted into the king's army, the very sons he had watched grow from boys into men. He remembered the king's men as arrogant and distant, their faces obscured by the polished steel of their helms. But the Northmen had been close and terrible, their painted faces and guttural war cries a sound that would forever haunt his nightmares. He looked at the blackened door, its charred surface, a stark, brutal contrast to the pure white snow that covered the ground. It was a symbol of a forgotten promise, a god who had been silent when the village needed him most. The bell tower, a proud, beautiful thing, was now broken, its rope hanging uselessly in the cold air. The bell would ring no more, not for prayer, not for weddings, and not for the dead. The elder saw the king and the raiders not as two opposing forces, but as two sides of the same terrible coin. Each demanded tribute, each spilled blood in the name of a different god, and each left behind a trail of grief and loss. He picked up a small, half-finished wooden carving from the snow, a tiny, simple figurine of a saint that had been dropped in the chaos of the raid. It was a symbol of a life that was taken, a small, fragile piece of devotion that was cut short. He felt the cold air seep into his bones, and he knew that this was not the end of the long, bitter winter, but only the beginning. The world had gone silent, and in that silence, he felt the heavy weight of a question that had no answer. Was it better to die fighting for a king who didn't care, or to die at the hands of raiders who didn't know your name? The blackened door, standing strong in its brokenness, was a monument to the resilience of a people caught between two brutal, unyielding forces, a resilience he knew the king would never see, and the raiders would never understand.